Well, good evening. We're actually going to start on time, which is a wonderful thing. Welcome to Envisioning the Future of Catholic Religious Archives. I'm Carroll Coburn, Professor of Religious Studies and Women's Studies at Avila University. I'm very pleased to be a part of this conference where we're going to discuss and formulate the important collaborations among historians, archivists, and religious leaders. Because what we're going to do here is going to be pretty amazing. We're going to vision the future of Catholic religious archives. I've heard people talk, we're in a crisis, or this is happening, or that is happening. And I want to thank Boston College, and particularly Christian and Malachi for all their work to pull us together on the advisory board and make this happen. We're actually going to move forward on this. I came to archival research on Catholic sisters in 1990 with Sister Martha Smith, CSJ, and my colleague at Avila University. And ultimately, we co-authored Spirited Lives, How Nuns Shape Catholic Culture and American Life. Over the last 3 decades, as a historian, I've been fortunate to work in many Catholic religious archives and with religious leaders, particularly of women's congregations. From these amazing experiences, I've learned a few things. First of all archival information is potentially informative and important. Qualitative and quantitative information from religious archives, particularly when integrated together, provide a richer, nuanced, methodological approach to analysis and context. This is really what brought me into this. As a historian of American women and American social history, there was a huge void in the scholarship in terms of the contributions and the life experiences of women religious. Preservation and access of congregational archives define and document their importance and significance to the historical record. This also allows us to challenge the traditional stereotypes and invisibility of sisters' and brothers' work, both inside the church and outside in the larger American narrative. And we're going to be talking about work within archives, we're going to be talking about US experience, we're going to be talking about global pieces to this, or universal aspects of this experience. So keep that in mind. We're going very macro here, very big picture. As a historian of apostolic women religious, I'm acutely aware of how American Catholic sisters have existed within the mainstream of American life through schools, hospitals, and social service work, even when sequestered in convent living situations prior to Vatican II. Sort of a contradiction of isolation and immersion. These activities provided sisters with understanding, really the nuances of the real world situations. In the post-Vatican II world, women religious became more cognizant, if not comfortable, in collaboration with each other and lay women and men, both within the auspices of the church and in larger secular endeavors, local, national, and global. Collaborative activities include peacework, social justice, healthcare, immigration, poverty, among other systemic and institutional inequalities. Long before internet global networks existed, religious congregations of men and women functioned as living networks, which have only expanded and increased as the technology has allowed all of us to know more people, places, events in the world. So here we are. Consequently, the title of this conference, Envisioning the Future of Catholic Religious Archives. It's an important title, but maybe the subtitle is even more important. After that colon, there are 3 words, a working conference. We want to tap into the resources and expertise of some of the most important players in preserving, accessing, and communicating the lives and work of religious and their contributions to the church and the nation. So that includes everyone in this room. That's what makes this conference different from most professional conferences. Yes, we hope you listen and take notes and ask questions as you would in other conferences. But more importantly, we want to empower you to engage in the thinking, reflection, and creation of the steps on how to move forward. You have already begun to do that with your comments on your applications and from initial pre-conference assessment of concerns. This was a survey that some of you, many of you probably filled out months ago, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow. The program planners and advisory committee had two main goals. And I'm going to take some notes from the website here because the goals are very clear, and these are not my words. I'm pulling them together for you to hear again. The first goal, to bring leaders of religious communities, archivists, and historians together to seek and identify solutions to the issues that communities, including those coming to completion, are facing in preserving and providing access to their archival legacies. Second, to assess and articulate common needs shared by religious archives as they plan for the future, developing strategies and resources to meet those needs so that the stories and contributions of Catholic religious communities may be appreciated, understood, and valued by scholars and society at large. This conference provides an integrated forum in which congregational leaders, archives practitioners, and scholars come together and participate, not just as active listeners, but as creators and visionaries to move these goals forward. Coming together, we will discuss strategies to position the rich documentary history of Catholic religious communities for long-term preservation, discoverability, and research. We will do this in a myriad of ways, and this is also somewhat unique. Not all conferences have these components. We'll have some formal presentations, as you'll see this evening and at times tomorrow, question and answer panels, small and large discussion groups, thematic focus groups, which we call lightning rounds. The conference planners and participants will document our individual and group ideas, strategies, and potential solutions. We'll either be recording those by hand in written form or electronically. Ultimately, a white paper will be produced after the conference for national dissemination. For those of you not familiar with the white paper, it's a written, authoritative document that fully informs the reader about a topic, combines expert knowledge and research, and provides solutions or recommendations on a particular problem or issue. Therefore, what we create here in the next 3 days and the subsequent white paper will provide understanding, strategies, and potential solutions for a variety of interested audiences. Sort of a best practices type of document for future preserving, accessing, and communicating the past, the present, and the future work of religious congregations, their archives, and the scholars who come to tell their stories. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our first panel, and we'll begin, and we'll let them get all of us started this evening. We have 3 experts to share their experience and expertise to help us begin our integration of thoughts and ideas on envisioning the future. The work of this panel began almost 3 months ago when we began emailing each other, sort of set up an email communication to share perspectives, ideas from the historian's perspective, an archivist's perspective, and the perspective of a religious leader. From the very beginning, we want to integrate and see these issues in a holistic way. Through email conversations, we combined our ideas and decided to focus on 3 important aspects of the discussion on Catholic religious archives. These are not definitive, but in all our conversations, we came up with 3 areas that kept reoccurring again and again from any of the 3 perspectives. One has to do with issues of preservation, another with accessibility, and the third with communication, and that certainly includes dissemination and the scholar's contribution to this. This panel hopes to set the stage for the integration of ideas and the collaborative aspects that make this conference unique, and to hopefully inspire and challenge all of you to vision the future as we go forward. Now let me introduce them very briefly to you. I know you have your programs and notes, but I'm going to introduce all 3 of them, and then I will sit down, and they will come up one at a time and share their thinking with you. And that way, if I introduce them all at once, then you won't have to see me traipsing up and down the stairs. When we're finished with the 3rd panelist, they will come up here, and they each have a mic, and we want to open it up to a Q&A. As the audience, you have 2 mics in each aisle here that you can come up and use and to ask questions so everybody can hear everything, because sometimes these things are hard. when you don't have mics to use. So that'll be our process. I want to first introduce Sister Ginger Downey, who is a current member of the leadership team for the Congregation of Our Lady of Victory Missionary Sisters. She serves the congregation as General Secretary and has been a member of the congregation since 1986. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology, a master's degree in theology, with an emphasis in liturgical studies from St. John University. She's done parish work as a director of religious education, pastoral associate in catechetics, and served as a liturgist for the Catholic Newman Center at Arizona State. She co-founded Faith on Fire, an adult formation ministry. Our second presenter is Jennifer Halloran. She is currently director of the Maryknoll Mission Archives, where she has worked for the last decade. She is a certified archivist with 19 years' experience in the field, who has a master's of library science and information science with a concentration in archives management from Simmons College. Prior to her current position, she worked on the photo archive as a photo archivist in the Maryknoll Mission Archive, an archivist in IBM Corporate Archives, and as project activist for History Associates. She's also published a couple of recent papers, both in gathered fragments. One is called A Missioner's Call, Sister Mary Del Rey Danforth. The second, both were in 2016. Her paper is called Maryknoll Mission Archive, Shepherding Maryknoll's History Through Time. Our third presenter is Maggie Mcginnis. She has been a professor of religion at LaSalle University since 2006. Prior to that, she was on the faculty at Cabrini University for 20 years. With James Fisher, she co-edited the Catholic Studies Reader from Fordham and is author of Neighbors and Missionaries, A History of the Sisters of Our Lady of Christian Doctrine. And she's also author of Called to Serve, A History of Nuns in America, New York University Press, which, by the way, won the Catholic Press Association's Award for General Excellence. She and I go way back from the beginning of the Conference on the History of Women Religious, so we've known each other a long time through that organization. She's currently, I told her she was crazy, but you'll understand why I said that. She's co-editing 3 different volumes related to Catholicism in the U.S. and working on a book entitled Catherine Drexel and Her Sisters, A History of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. So please welcome our panelists.
Good evening. I drove the short straw. Or maybe I drew the long straw. In May 2009, the traveling exhibit, Women and Spirit, Catholic Sisters in America, opened in Cincinnati. And for the next 3 years, it toured the United States. This exhibit was a remarkable resource for providing education on the life of women religious and their contributions to the United States from 1727 until the early 2000s. It made a huge impact, drawing more than 1 million visitors. The Leadership Conference of Women Religious sponsored and produced the Women in Spirit, Catholic Sisters in America exhibit. However, it recounted the contribution of relatively a small number of congregations of women religious. The exhibit was dismantled after a permanent home could not be found, although there is a DVD available from the LCWR. I mention this because it illustrates that there is an interest to know about women religious and to hear their stories from their own voices. I firmly believe that if stories of congregations, both men and women, are not preserved, the history of Catholicism in the United States, and for those in Canada, I had dinner with them, in Canada as well, or wherever, will be incomplete. It has become more evident to me in the last 6 years the time that I have been in congregational leadership, I have found much from my archivist, realizing that the story of my own congregation will be lost if it is not actively worked at to collaborate with others to have our history preserved. Every congregation has a unique charism and a unique way of expressing that charism through their ministry and their life. My congregation did not have institutions. Rather, we were in places where many others did not want to go, serving an unrecognizable and unrecognized population. We lived among the people. In the early days, it was the poor Hispanics in the southwest part of the United States, mainly rural. Later, we lived in the barrios where there was poverty, or in areas where there was relatively small Catholic populations. The formation of the sisters was instructed to meet both the temporal as well as the spiritual needs of the people. In addition, many congregations like mine did not learn how to talk about themselves. We were not good at bragging about what we had done or recognizing our accomplishments. It was often seen as false humility, and everything should be done for the greater glory of God. Did you notice that in the church this afternoon? It was up there in Latin. It's one of the few things I know in Latin. Or in my community, we often stressed, all for Jesus through Mary. Therefore, many events and our accomplishments were not always documented well, if at all. I believe that our footprint will be lost if we do not find ways to collaborate with others to tell the story of our women and the impact they had in catechetics and to ministry with the Hispanics, and informing and being with the grassroots organizations that have gone on to become national or internationally recognized. We are but one small congregation, and I truly believe that this is the truth for many congregations. Future planning is what leaders of congregations are doing, and we are doing it in a time of change. Pope Francis talks about it being an epoch of change. It is not an epoch of change, it is a change of epoch. Therefore, we are keenly aware that one of our tasks is to preserve the past, so that in time it will tell the story of a brave group of pioneering women who did great things in order that others might experience the reign of God. This is the foundation which the next generation of religious men and women will build as they move into an unknown future. As I pondered the three elements of this conference, leadership, archivists, and historian, I came to understand that these three areas have to work together to find new ways to preserve our history, to tell the unique story of religious life in the United States and Canada, and begin to uncover the larger, more complex reality that is the very fabric of Catholicism. Not only Catholicism in the United States and Canada, but how we have influenced the world. One of the responsibilities of leadership is to care for its members. I would also add that leadership is also responsible to make sure that those who have gone before us are also cared for, and that their contributions to religious life, the Catholic Church, and the world are not lost. Along with this, I believe that it is important for leaders to understand how important it is not only to support the archivist, personally and financially, It is the leaders that make the decision about where the budgetary dollars go. So leaders need to realize how important archives are. But we also need to encourage them. We need to have conversations, both the leaders and the archivists together, so that we can decide what are the important aspects and the essentials of the congregations that need to be preserved. What is the story that we want to tell? Then from there, it will be easier to determine what is important to keep. We all know that we can't keep everything, although we have a few sisters who have tried. I really liked Father Charles's little poem or prayer at the end, because we all know there are some people that think we should keep absolutely everything, and yet we know we really can't. And some stuff we have to really admit really isn't worth keeping. We recently had a sister die who thought that we should keep every one of her very unfocused photographs. Once the framework is formed, the story can be told in the voices of those who actually lived it. It is also important to realize what a valuable resource the archivist can be as we try to outline the different aspects of congregational history or to illustrate patterns of behavior. I have not been in the congregation as long as other members, and I have to rely on the historical data that is found in our archives to help lay out timelines. I ask our archivist to help me get information about what happened and when, so I can try to understand the circumstances and the context. This gives me a better understanding of a particular decision and some of the background story, so that it makes more sense. I am fortunate that the early leadership teams, the ones that were before me, saw the value in having a professional with a passion for history and the capacity for organization. I find having a professional archivist who has an understanding about not only what to keep, but also how to preserve it, invaluable to my role in leadership. I'm sure my archivist would really love it if I wouldn't ask for so many back histories in leadership minutes. I also see the connection to historians who have an interest in certain historical periods or facets of history. They are the ones that take a broad view and weave together the contributions from different congregations, showing what religious men and women have done in a variety of ways with a variety of issues. These historians need the help to have the access to congregational archives, to have the ability to work with primary sources in order to do their own scholarly research, which will allow for more objectivity in creating fuller and a complete picture. An example is Hispanic ministry, something my congregation has been about for nearly 100 years. Yet many historians and academics may not have ever heard of my congregation. So how do we network together so that we can piece the universal story together so it is not lost? It is my hope that this conference will connect these three groups together so that a fuller story of the history of the Catholic Church in the United States and in Canada may be written, and maybe someday our contribution to the rest of the world. And maybe at least some may find an interest in generating research. The archivist is the point person in finding the pearl of great price that could be the next doctoral dissertation or bring to light a valuable contribution that may not yet be widely known. I believe that each of these three perspectives represented here hold a piece of the puzzle. When put together, the authentic and fullest picture of the church emerges, one that none of the three disciplines can do alone. Congregations make history by the ministry their members do or did. Archives preserve the history by making sure the artifacts, whether they be the written or spoken word, or the shoes of a saint, are kept and maintained with care. Then the historians research and can help to make known the story in ways that are accessible to anyone who wants to learn more about men and women who worked to build the foundation of the church. Not only the church, but also the larger contribution that religious life has made to society and the world. Men and women religious have been a part of making history, not necessarily with the rich and powerful or in the boardrooms, but in the grassroots movements, the places of poverty and social justice and advancement of human dignity. And as Father said tonight, this is the story of religious, and this is the story that is worth telling and retelling. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very excited to be here for what is truly a unique opportunity to have everyone who is part of a record's life cycle in the room, creators, caretakers, and users, so that we may listen to one another and work together to serve, each in our own way, American Catholic and world history. My job this evening is to place before you the archivist's point of view, our concerns, our struggles, and our joy in our work. As part of the advisory committee, I reviewed the survey responses and applications for this conference. My colleagues in this room represent the full spectrum of archives, from nascent to mature programs. Collectively, we are the fulcrum on which this movement to preserve and provide access to American Catholic history rests. It's a heavy burden to try to shoulder alone. One of my great hopes for the next few days is that the archivists come to feel less alone, more supported, understood by their colleagues in the archival realm, by the leaders whose history and legacy they care for, and the researchers who they assist in their academic endeavors. I also hope that our discussion and problem solving as recorded in the future white paper will provide solace and guidance for the future to our colleagues in each area who could not be with us this week. I must confess that I am ill-equipped to tell every unique archive story in this room. And in the interest of full disclosure, I must tell you that my institution is certainly a mature archive, in existence for more than a quarter century, well supported by leadership, and used by researchers from around the world. I want to share some of the Maryknoll Mission Archive story, not in a self-congratulatory manner, but as a way of illustrating some of the challenges we all share, that you may see some aspects of your archives or future archives model reflected in our experience. In 1990, at the recommendation of an archives consultant, the leadership of the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers and the Maryknoll Sisters made the decision to bring together under one roof and managed by one staff, both of their archives. Previously, the society and congregation had been independently maintaining almost 80 years of their respective histories. The collaborative Maryknoll Mission Archives brought together 160 years of Maryknoll's foreign mission work. In 2001, Maryknoll's third major expression, the Maryknoll Mission Association of the Faithful, joined the department. Today, in addition to those three stakeholders, the archives also houses the records of the Maryknoll affiliates, the Religious Task Force on Central America and Mexico, and the United States Catholic Mission Association. Leadership's vision of one home for the entire Maryknoll story has proved to be inspired, greatly benefiting their budgets, as well as internal and external researchers alike. Since its inception, the Archives program has enjoyed strong support from leadership and more than adequate budgetary resources. Over time, staffing has evolved from a mix of society members, sisters, and laity to today's configuration of 4 full-time laypersons and 1 society member. Over the last 5 years, we've answered, on average, just over 600 reference requests annually. We have a website which allows us to share finding aids for our open collections, as well as information from the collections through our blog. Archives materials are highly used by all aspects of the society and congregation, especially the marketing, communications, fundraising, and mission education segments. We are fortunate to have academics and other external researchers interested in our collections who have utilized them for various books, articles, films, and other projects. So quite an enviable position we find ourselves in. But in many ways, we are not set apart from the universal challenges each archivist in this room faces. Collaboration is tricky, since everyone has a financial interest. We are one staff, technically employed by 3 organizations, not just 1. We must be very aware of how we apportion our time and efforts working on each group's collections, and that our public relations efforts, online or through exhibits, are balanced and inclusive. When I meet with the Archives leadership liaisons from the Society, Sisters, and Lay Missioners each quarter, I must be mindful of having made progress for each and able to articulate that progress in a manner not laden with archival jargon. Then, every 6 years, when leadership changes, I have the responsibility of explaining what the Archives does and why it is important, in the hope that the new group will continue to agree. The collaborative nature of the project can also complicate relationships with other departments who tend to forget that we serve more than one organization and our time and efforts are split in many directions. Being a mature archive with established policies and procedures has not made us immune to the challenge of identifying and collecting pertinent records from the organizations. "You don't really want that stuff, do you?" is a common response during conversations about departmental record transfers and donations of personal papers. That mindset makes us fear what might be destroyed, yet we do not have the agency to compel people to send their records to the archives. Our best hope is an ongoing education and re-education process for people whose primary job focus is not records management. Collecting personal papers from missioners can also be delicate. Some see them as a contribution to the greater mission story, and others prefer to be struck from history. The latter is truly sad, but must be respected. We recently had a sister who told us she destroyed her early journals as she did not want those youthful writings to define her legacy. The archive staff mourned what might have been in those writings, but ultimately had to respect her decision. The records that do successfully make it into the archives then pose challenges of sheer volume and complications of formats and technology. In 2008, the Society closed what was then called their photo library and transferred the contents to archives. This collection alone, one of many other image collections, is estimated to include well over 1 million unique images. In 2014, another storage facility on the Society's property was cleaned out, and an audiovisual collection of almost 3,000 unique items came to archives containing every format from film reels to digital beta tapes. These 2 accessions are examples of complicated groups of records that archives must puzzle over how to responsibly cope with while considering the impacts on the organization, possible researchers, the materials themselves, and history. What can we responsibly do within our limitations is the question we must return to in each case. While archivists are still coping with the preservation and access issues of formats past, we are also increasingly pressed by the needs and desires of technology centered today and tomorrow, which present themselves in many ways. First, there are the born digital files that we all have been creating, sending, copying, and almost never assessing and purging for at least a few decades. Technology has made creation and storage very easy and cheap, so the volume increases exponentially over those handwritten or typed documents housed in a file drawer that runs out of room quickly. For example, take these two groups of records: handwritten letters penned and received by a Maryknoll missioner in the field in the 1960s, and the email box of that same missioner from the first decade of the 21st century, filled with email chains with multiple recipients and a web of separate but related answers, file attachments, and undeleted advertising, all in file formats that may not be viable after the next decade. Now ask me which set of records I would prefer to be responsible for appraising, organizing, describing, and providing access to into the foreseeable future. Then, there is the growing expectation that archives have resources to convert all their records to digital files, and that those files will be made publicly available. On-site and remote researchers and visitors are often dismayed to discover that 99% of our collections are not available electronically, and at this time there are no plans to systematically scan the collection. In the Google-centric world in which we live, old-fashioned page turning is no longer the preferred method for many. What I believe people fail to understand are the costs associated with such a digital conversion project, the associated access concerns, and the question of who is going to store, maintain, and migrate those files long-term. Onion skin paper makes feed scanning impossible. Photos need metadata entered by a human being. Individual files must be housed in a system that makes them searchable. Would the scan stand up as an official document if needed? By providing unfettered access to our records on the internet, we will have effectively lost control of who uses them and how. What for most people is just a simple question, why don't you scan it, is a very complicated issue for archivists who must carefully consider the details and risks of such a project. Once, a visitor to the archives was incredulous that the records were not online. He reached into his pocket, pulled out $1, handed it to me, and stated that it was a donation toward rectifying the problem. For me, he represents those who cannot understand the deep implications and challenges posed by electronic records. Not only are the records we deal with increasingly born digital, but also how we connect with the world outside our walls has moved definitively into the virtual realm. I think for many archivists, this outreach method is technically difficult and often takes a back seat to the more pressing issues of preparing records for research and keeping up with daily reference requests. In our case, we have a site that is in need of a technical update, but it must wait for work on fundraising and vocation segments, today's pressing issues, to be complete. What we are lacking are meaningful virtual connections with the research community at large. Perceptions about who we are and what we do complicate our work as well. If I was paid every time someone within the organization or a visitor said to any of the staff some variation of, "I don't know how you do what you do," I'd be crazy. I don't think any of us would ever have to work again. Among certain segments of our colleagues, we continue to fight the perception that we are glorified file clerks and that formal master's degree level training is not truly necessary. As much as I love being an archivist, I sometimes wonder if a title like information manager or information professional would make a difference in how others see us. Of all the challenges in our work, technology has certainly placed the most emphasis on the fact that archivists, now more than ever, need engaged partners in our work. We need leadership partners who will help shape what access to their records looks like and provide needed support and validation for archives initiatives. We need technology partners who will bring skill sets from web development to database and electronic records management to be in conversation with us as we navigate collection management and outreach. We need research partners who will help us identify and connect with groups and resources to make our collections and services known. In return, we will continue to do our very best to meet and balance the needs and concerns of all groups who contribute to and utilize the records in our care. I have only scratched the surface of the concerns that we archivists have, and I hope that you have seen yourselves reflected in part of the Maryknoll Mission Archives experience. I hold the same fears and concerns for the long-term future of Maryknoll's recorded history as part of the American Catholic experience as you hold for your institution's collections. As archivists, I think we can become too myopic, concerning ourselves narrowly with only what falls in the realm of how we execute our jobs, not why we execute them. I am blessed with 3 young women on the archive staff who see the broader picture, that we are here to serve. Each day, we care for the enduring legacy of Maryknoll missioners like Father Vincent Capodanno, a Navy chaplain who volunteered for duty in Vietnam. He was killed in the line of duty, ministering to the spiritual needs of his Marines. The Maryknoll sisters, who founded the first fully integrated health center, Queen of the World Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Father John Romaniello, affectionately known as the Noodle Priest, who used a simple machine and relief food supplied by Catholic Relief Services to feed starving refugees in Hong Kong beginning in the second half of the 1950s. And Sister Bernadette Yoshimoshi, who was born in Japan and in 1942 was working in Monrovia, California. Instead of returning to the safety of the Sisters' mother house, Sister Bernadette chose to enter the Manzanar internment camp with Sister Susanna Hayashi to serve her people for the next 3 years. For them, and for all Maryknoll missioners, the Maryknoll Mission Archives thanks the researchers who have respectfully, intelligently, and compassionately told their stories. We need you to help us continue our work, drawing attention to this important segment of Americans and the wide and deep impact they have had on American life and world history. May all of us in this room work together to ensure that the impact of American Catholic religious is not lost to time and neglect. Thank you.
Good evening. So I think most of us in this room are familiar with the Ancestry.com commercials that want you to buy a DNA test. The ones where the guy thought he was German, and they even wore lederhosen, but he's found out he's Scottish, and so he's wearing kilts now. So I've not taken the DNA test, but I do know a few things about some of my family members. And a few months ago, when I was looking at some census records from the 19th century, I happened to look up my great-grandmother, Catherine Morrissey, who lived her entire life in and around Warren, Rhode Island, about 50 miles south of here. And I know that Catherine married Michael Hanley and that they had 5 children, one of whom was my grandmother. But what I didn't know was something that appeared in the 1870 census. Catherine Morrissey, age 14, was a mill worker. And I think about that all the time now. And I think about the fact that that's what those people on Ancestry want to know about. It's not about kilts, it's about Catherine Morrissey and who their family members were. And I've been asked to talk to you tonight about where historians fit into what we will be discussing over the next couple of days. But not from the perspective of DNA tests, from the perspective of Catherine Morrissey. And in a way, it's a little hard to talk about this because there are so many different ways to look at it. But I want to give it a try and say a little bit about this from the perspective of the three themes that our panel has decided are important, the themes that Carroll mentioned at the beginning: preservation, accessibility, and communication. So preservation. So when you come right down to it, historians are just more intense versions of those people trying to write their family histories. We're looking at a bit of a larger picture, and in this case, the picture is the history of women and men religious. And this is where archives comes into the story, because it is through the material that you have preserved about your past that we come to understand the history of your congregation and how it fits into the larger histories of religious life, religious history, especially Catholic, but if you are devoted to Call the Midwife, you know that there are Anglican nuns out there too. Social history, women's history, the history of professions, and the list goes on. Why would anyone write a history of education that didn't discuss Catholic sisters or brothers? But they do. And it's up to people like me and my colleagues in this area to set the record straight. So to set the record straight, we have to know that there is material out there to tell the story. And as a trained historian, I understand the reasons why I do not and should not have access to current personnel files, legal documents, financial records. I get all of that. But in at least one instance, a file that I don't think I thought was very important turned out to be incredibly helpful. When I was writing the history of the Sisters of Our Lady of Christian Doctrine, congregational leaders and I agreed on what sources were accessible to me. The sisters were remarkably generous, not only with their time and their willingness to share documents, to say nothing of their prayers, by the way, but in recounting stories about individual sisters that had been handed down over the years. And one day, a sister told me about a Sister Claire, long deceased, who other members of the community did not find very pleasant. And in fact, she told me that the kids who hung around the congregation's settlement house in Lower Manhattan once called a local funeral home and told them Sister Claire was dead and they should come pick up the body. She was very much alive. So a little bit later, I'm looking at files of deceased sisters, not personnel files, but some of the files were just a list of assignments. Some had greeting cards and letters in there. Some of us are savers and some of us are throwers. And in Sister Claire's file, I found letters from her parents telling her that she had ruined the family by entering religious life. When she entered the community during the Depression, she had left a job that was allowing her to contribute to the family finances. And that stream of income was now gone, and they were disowning her. And she had written her family a letter that was returned to sender unopened, that she had kept for all those years. I did not open the letter. I so wanted to, but I didn't. What does all that tell us about Sister Claire? About the sacrifices families made when their daughters and sons entered religious life, about the strength of someone's vocation. So if congregations don't save something, we can't ever know about that. One more example about preservation. As Carroll said, I'm currently working on a history of Catherine Drexel and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and trying to move beyond the very traditional riches to rags story and focus on her work and the work of the congregation. And I happened to ask the archivists at Catholic U a couple of months ago if there was anything related to Drexel and the SBS in the CUA archives. And about a week later, I got an email. Yep, they did have some material related to Drexel. A lot of it was tax stuff, But one thing in the email really jumped out at me, and I quote, "The mission helpers of the Sacred Heart records, currently unprocessed, includes a box of correspondence between Drexel and Mother Demetrius of the Mission Helper Sisters." So I turned my grades in and headed down to D.C., and I didn't know very much about the Mission Helpers of the Sacred Heart, and I didn't know what would be in those boxes. But it turned out that Drexel and her biological sister Louise funded several of their apostolates because they had gotten interested in the congregation's work. And I really got a good sense of how Drexel worked. In one series of letters, Catherine and Louise are questioning a plumbing bill. The mission helpers say their plumber thinks it's a perfectly reasonable bill. The Drexel sisters say, their plumber doesn't think it's very reasonable at all. He thinks it's too high. And it goes on. 6, 8, 10 letters. Their plumber offers to go down and take a look at the pipe. I also uncovered an example of intercongregational cooperation from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Drexel occasionally asks the mission helpers, for instance, if they can accept a child at one of their apostolates. So the moral of the story, and please don't tell my husband I said this, is save your stuff. Not your unfocused photographs, but your stuff. So accessibility. As a historian, we want to be really able to access your material, the appropriate material. And all of those working in the area of women and men religious that I know, and I think I know a lot of them, want to do the right thing. And it's really hard sometimes to get your work done when people are suspicious of your motives and intentions. Just ask any 11th grader. They'll tell you that. And when we don't gain access, sometimes the full historical account doesn't emerge. And I have to admit that sometimes I'm puzzled by this. And so maybe another way to think about this is in the form of a question. What are you afraid of? Is there information in your archives that might reflect negatively, at least in your mind, on your religious congregation? Probably. Does it change the narrative? Maybe. Does it take away from the good that's been done? No. I'm just starting to read a book with the title Jefferson's Daughters, 3 Sisters, White and Black in a Young America. Does looking at Thomas Jefferson from this vantage point change how we think about him? I think so. But are we going to throw out the Declaration of Independence, shut down the University of Virginia over this? I hope not. So, do the archives of religious congregations contain information related to mother generals who were not the best leaders, examples of racism, stories or incidents that today's sisters, brothers, and priests might be a bit embarrassed about? Sure. But at some point, we all have to trust the process. The truth has to win out, whether you're writing about Thomas Jefferson or the Maryknoll sisters. Not the truth presented in the National Enquirer, but the truth is presented in Jefferson Daughters or Penny Lerneau's history of the Maryknoll sisters. So third, communication. To state the obvious, we all have to communicate with each other. When I began looking at Catherine Drexel and the SBS, I communicated pretty much exclusively with the lay archivist, who shared information with her supervisor at the time, who was a member of the congregation. I don't really know what I told her, but I have to assume that she writes reports that contain stats and information and all sorts of things about what work gets done in there. Now that those archives are housed within the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archives and administered by that staff, I presume that they will let the members of the congregational leadership team know what's happening with those archives. I do want to know the sisters. It's not an authorized history, and so I don't really need their approval, but I would certainly like their blessing. When I was working on the Sisters of Christian Doctrine, I got to know a lot of members of the community very well. And when you get to communicate like that, the stories that you get are just priceless. You can't beat those stories. During breaks in archives, I really appreciate being able to share a particular finding with an archivist. The story of Sister Claire would never have happened if one of the sisters hadn't stopped in to visit me one day. When I was working in the SBS archives, I mentioned to the archivist, I said, you know, it looks to me like St. Catherine Drexel was a Republican. Of course she was, she said to me. She had a lot of money. I was like, yeah, you got a point. She said, and one more thing. She was really mad when they put a federal income tax law in. You know, she said that because it meant she could give out a lot less money. One example from my own work about how a lack of communication caused a bit of a problem. As I was working on my book, I published an article on the Sisters of Christian Doctrine in U.S. Catholic Historian. I didn't think much about it. A couple of the archivist and some of the leadership team knew I was writing it. One part of the story of this congregation, and I think a lot of you in here will be able to relate to this, is that at one point a pastor wanted 2 sisters working in a parish to be replaced with 2 others, the reasons of which I did not understand or know about. Since the time frame for this event was the late 1970s, the leadership team was no longer having that kind of process take place. You don't talk to the bishop about this situation, they told the pastor, you talk to us. Long story short, the sisters wound up withdrawing from that ministry and another congregation took over their work. Because of my experience in working in this field, I knew that that story was not a big deal. But some members of the congregation took exception to what I had written, and I was summoned, and I use that word deliberately, to a meeting with the president and a couple of members of the leadership team. Who gave you access to those files, they asked. And I had to figure out a way to say, you did. But fortunately, several members of the community had been reading drafts of my chapters all along and smoothed things over, and it all worked out. One kind of final thing. If someone is going to use your archives, you have to be prepared to see your name in print, whether it's in books, journals, conference programs, or blogs. And even though we are not out to get you, you might prickle at some of what is said or written. None of us are perfect, and if historians and archivists communicate with congregational leaders, and so on and so forth, this should all work reasonably well, and the story should get out there. So to conclude, this is about more than Ancestry.com and kilts. It's about Catherine Morrissey. It's about history and making sure that the historical account is correct. Historians want to take on that task, but we need your help. Your archives, your story, will help us all to better understand what happened and why. And in the end, that can only be a good thing. Thank you.
Okay, we'll give them a minute to get to their chairs and their microphones. And as a reminder to the audience, we have 2 standing mics, almost on the front row here, but in the aisles. And so thank you very much to all our presenters. Those were great, and I appreciate it greatly. You see the integration, I think. You hear it in many ways from a different perspective, but you see how it all fits together. Do we have questions, comments from the audience to all the panelists, one of the panelists? Don't be shy. You can walk down and so that you can be heard, so I don't have to repeat it, because this is a big enough room where I probably would need to repeat the question if the person isn't speaking into a mic, so don't let that intimidate you. Yes, sir?
I don't need to walk down, it's too hard.
Okay.
From Ms. McGuinness, why did the Blessed Sacrament nuns turn their archives over to Philadelphia? And is that a problem?
It was their choice. They are I think they have sold the mother house and the property on which the archives were located. And they were going to be in a lot more smaller quarters. And so they needed a place.
Joe's or LaSalle or Villanova, an educational place that would be more focused on making them available to researchers. Yes, no?
Well, so I heard somebody down here say, why not Xavier? And I'm not sure why not Xavier. That's a really good question. I don't think Xavier is sure why not Xavier, honestly. But as I understand it, they called the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Archives were moving. They were moving to a new building, a better facility, better HVAC and all that stuff. And the sisters were interested in working out an arrangement, and it worked out. They could have explored other places, not just Catholic. Temple, for instance, has a huge urban archives, you know, but their decision was made to go with the Archdiocese, and I'm not part of the leadership team there, so I don't know why.
I can just say that from the leadership perspective, it's sometimes very difficult to find a place that will accept them. And you've got to realize that there's the archives that is the public stuff, and then there's also all the paper that is the personnel files, and there's also a private and then a secret archives that is undisclosed. So it may be a couple of different things that caused that. And it could have been that other places weren't willing to have it, which is unfortunately becoming somewhat of an issue as congregations, especially in the United States, become smaller. There's a number of congregations that are looking for places to put their archives, but also their artifacts.
Yeah, and Drexel had a lot of artifacts. I will say one thing, that the place the Archdiocese was moving their archives was a school that had closed, that they had rehabbed, and so there's just a ton of space there. You know, it might have just been as simple as cubic feet. You know.
Yes.
Mine is more of a comment than a question, but it's a question of sensitivity in archives and access. And I work for the USCCB and for the Catholic News Service, and we have worked in conjunction with the Catholic Research Resources Alliance, and we have digitized the National Catholic Welfare Conference news feeds from 1920, and we're working to get them up to 1985. Sometimes you'll find things that don't reflect well on the church. Sometimes you'll find things that reflect very well on the church. And for people to be afraid to allow access because of things that have actually happened is a shame. So I'll just say that you have to take the good with the bad and to provide access, because that is the factual history, the evidential history of the church. And so these are freely available online at thecatholicnewsarchive.org. And more of the diocesan newspapers in this country and in Canada are participating in this newspaper campaign to make this available. So just wanted to let folks know about that.
Thank you.
My question's for Ms. Halloran. You talked about educational efforts within the Maryknoll Sisters. I assume that's within however the company is organized. What sort of educational efforts have you gone through with your sisters or with your government or with anybody else? It's
done sort of in pieces. So of course there's ongoing leadership education. Every time you meet with them, you bring topics that are going on, things you want them to be aware of, so that there's the leadership education at that level. Then fortunately the Maryknoll Sisters, when they're home on renewal, they make a stop at the archives part of their being home. So we work very hard to not only ask them for things, but to show them what it is we're doing with their things, who has been in to use them, how these things are being utilized, who's interested. And that seems to make a great difference to them, because so often they're like, it's just my stuff, nobody cares. But especially when you can demonstrate that people are interested in using them, that's been a great help. And then we try to sneak it in. When you're dealing with, especially departments, sometimes it can be really hard to get them to have a formal meeting to sit down and talk about their records management. We try. Or when they're asking for something that they think we should have, and you get in there, well, if you had sent it to us, we'd have it. We don't make this stuff up whole cloth. You have to give it to us in order to be able for us to return it to you. So yeah, we kind of do it sneaky. It's kind of like guerrilla education. But that seems to work the best, actually. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Good.
Sure.
So along with the issue of sensitivity of records, I've heard in some circles that the records really cannot be accessed because somebody has to come in and identify them item level or a certain way before they are made accessible. So I guess my question to the historian with the archivist present is, there has been a lot of discussion about the problems with the finding aid. So what are your thoughts on the way archivists have organized the records, and do you think that as a historian, there's another option? I'm just throwing this out there, yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends on the archives, right? And it depends on the finding aid, and some are more helpful than others. But I think what you always need in conjunction with the finding aid is a conversation with the archivist. I mean, there's nothing like, going into the Maryknoll archives or whatever and having Jennifer be able to say, well, you might be interested in this, which a historian might not have even known about or wouldn't have even thought it was there. So finding aids are great. They're kind of the first line, right, when you start to look for stuff. And they're more or less helpful depending on the finding aid and depending on what you're looking for.
Yeah, I will piggyback on what you're saying. I think that the conversation is the most important part, especially when you have, like we have with a collaborative collection, we have a researcher that may have found one piece online through a finding aid. But then when they start talking to us, we go, hey, by the way, did you know that they were also doing that, or were missioned in a certain place? And maybe you want to look at that component. Finding aids are a nice start, but it's the archivist who's looked at every piece of paper. They know what's in that file. They know how to make the connections. And I think that, with the historian being able to explain where they're headed, we can often help shape that.
I'm asking this question from a research perspective, but the thing, who was it who was asking about the USCCB? It just sparked it. Sometimes, people, whenever there are studies done where people are interviewed, the people who are interviewed often feel betrayed by what's written because they have a very deep sense of where they were going with what was being asked about, and they think they've told all this very careful stuff, and then somebody uses it for purposes other than the ones in which they were talking, or they don't get cited that much and somebody else gets cited. So I can imagine that, so maybe this is a question partly for Ginger as much as the others, that I can imagine easily that the people from a congregation who commissioned something to somebody who is not a member of that congregation and doesn't quite get it, by whatever definition of get it there is, that would be a common experience of somebody outside being the archivist or the historian. So I'm just wondering, is that common? Is it different when it's the archivists and historians of religious orders? Are you more careful about what's going on in the religious order that you're keeping records of and so forth? Or does my question make no sense at all?
No, it makes sense. It definitely makes sense. We're thinking about where to start with it.
Okay.
Where do I want to start? You want to?
Well, I can just do simply. We're just commissioned a book to tell the last 50 years of the congregation from the 5 living presidents. And it's being written by someone not of the congregation. And so what the leadership team decided was that each of the presidents, because they're living, have the opportunity to read their chapter and to make critiques on the accurateness of what this said. They don't get to edit it. So that's what we've done. I think with deceased sisters, we would have, the congregation would look at what we wanted to have said, what was the period we'd look at, and really try to set some guidelines, and then hope for the best. I mean, that's terrible to say, but I think, and read it. And I think for us, we will, the leadership, there's 3 of us, we will read each chapter after the presidents do, and then make our own final decision. But I think somebody has to have that position. If the person's alive, I would hope that we would always let them at least read their part to make sure that they did get what they said or the nuance of it.
I can say, working with sisters who have been responsible for writing histories of their mission areas, they're the one in charge, they've been appointed by leadership to do it. That is not always smooth sailing. They will finish it, and it goes out to the other sisters in the congregation, and the next thing you hear is, well, we need to make an edit, or she said this, or she said that, or we don't like that. So I think no matter who's writing it, the person has a point of view. Maybe they got an axe to grind, maybe they don't. And I don't think until you get into that writing process and the conversation process with the person who's using the records and writing it, that you really start to get a feeling for what that person is doing, and they can still blindside you in the end. But what's the other option? Don't let anybody write anything?
Right, yeah, I was just thinking that a few years ago, a congregation asked me to take a look at a draft of their history that they had been writing. It was kind of a group effort, and it had kind of been put down and picked back up, and put down and picked back up. And they handed it to me, and they said, well, would you read this, and would you give us your thoughts on it? And would you keep in mind that 4 of the people on this team are English teachers? Like, in other words, be very careful what you say about verbs and adverbs here, you know? Yeah, I mean, in a way, you just have to, I mean, it's like any work we do, you know? We in the end, we hope for the best.
We told our last president, one of our presidents is an English teacher, and we said, you don't get to edit.
Right.
I mean, we had some very strict things.
We've had fights about how do you format it.
Yeah.
You know, like one sister looks at what somebody else did and goes, oh, you didn't follow the format, you need to get a professional. It's, yeah. There's always.
That's why we went outside.
If I could just comment, because I'm on both sides of the aisle, because I'm an archivist and a historian. And I really think that the key for the archivist and the historian is really to develop a trust.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, in working with people who used art collections, and when I was a monk at St. Anselm, and when I helped out the Sisters of Mercy in Chicago in writing their history, there really is a bond that has to develop between, an intimate bond that has to develop between the congregation and the person writing the history. And I think people are very much aware that they don't want to embarrass
Right.
the community. For example, at St. Anselm, there was great contention in the 20s, and one of the monks laid in wait with a baseball bat to get the newly elected abbot. Now, that story had to be told. They didn't have to say his name, but that incident and the contention that occurred in the 1920s really shaped that community and how it saw into the future. So I think you have to, there's ways to do it that you don't divulge people's names, but you have to share because it's part of how a community grows, how it evolves, and how it sees itself and basically what it is going to embrace. And I think that's critical. But I think that I think one of the things that I was struck with the application process and the survey is that all the archivists and leaders, they rely on personal interaction. Is critical in this, in our profession as religious archivists. And I think that's what we have to highlight, and how do we develop that to move forward. Thank you.
I have a background that is a little bit different, and I've worked at the National Archives for 20 years. So accessibility is a very interesting conversation between myself as a religious archivist, is the sense that there is a certain drop dead date where you can release records of, personal type of interaction of the sisters, and because it tells a story of the decision-making process, and it tells the story of sometimes of compassion and sometimes like they had to make a hard decision. And I'm wondering if, as leadership and as archivists and maybe as a historian, how, because these files contain letters back and forth between the sister and the province, superior, saying this and that kind of thing, but the sisters are dead more than 50 years, and everybody in the letter is considered dead. And so I'm wondering if there can be a certain discussion in the historian's perspective, because some of those records are very unique, and they talk about a story of people and how compassionate the sisters were and how compassionate the people who were going through this process are. So if you have these sets of files that are separate in this kind of fashion, how do you join it together to get a fuller picture of that person, who's a sister or a brother or a priest, or how do you get the fuller picture of the congregation itself as it moved through from the 19th century into the 20th century into the 21st century? I know this is a tough question because we've had a panel on it at ACWR, and we just, I'm constantly trying to figure out a way to deal with this. Now, I also deal with oral histories, so that sense I said, sisters, you can put when do you want this open type thing for research? Because some of those stories tend to be much more personal and actually reveal things that are not in the actual official records.
So just two things, and I don't want to open the oral history can of worms, but for historians, we're very governed by institutional review boards and all kinds of things, and what we can do, and so that's sort of beyond our control. But when I talked to you earlier about Sister Claire, none of that got in the book, right? But what that did was it helped me to understand that community better. It wasn't a book of stories, it was a historical account, and so in the end, you're kind of picking and choosing, right? And hoping that what you put out is a good, complete, balanced picture of it.
Yeah, access is a tough thing. I work in a what is essentially a private collection. There can be access, it's a policy, but it's more like guidelines. And just because someone is dead or something happened 50 years ago does not mean that there are not still high sensitivities within the community about that issue. So then my job becomes to basically take the temperature. How do you feel about this? And work toward, as an archivist, I want to work toward as much access as possible. But I also fully understand that I am not the final say. It's not my history, it's not my records. So I can help guide, shape, talk, bring awareness that maybe it's okay, maybe this isn't as, dire as you think it is. I can also control really vetting who's coming in. Looking at who these people are, do you have a solid background? What are the types of things you've written before? And that gives you clues as to who. So for where I sit, I feel like the archivist's responsibility is to understand who wants to use it and why, and to understand the sensitivities, or be able to ask the question of the congregation or the society and say, can we come to some middle ground here where we can tell some of this story, but of course being mindful that it still is yours. So
I think from leadership it would be, and I can only talk from my own perspective, but I think the why is always really important. Why do you want to know this? And what's the greater good? And I think, is it just to go looking, fishing for something? Our church has a lot of people that I think go fishing for something. And so my question would be why? And I would rely on our archivist. I would rely on, I think your idea of taking the temperature is really good. Is this going to cause a lot of unrest with the sisters or brothers or priests? But to go deeper into the why.
I think it's really interesting that all of the conversation is revolving the whole time around sensitivities in some way, either about research ethics or about the sensitivities of sisters when their records are used. And because it's an opening session where we're trying to consider themes that are going to occupy possibly a white paper, I would love to see this staying as one of your themes if it works through the 3 or 4 days. Because you've given answers, particularly in your last answer, for example, where with congregations that I've worked with, if they saw those written down, they would nearly be more reassured. In Ireland, when congregations don't want people to use certain things or have access to certain parts of their records, they will say, people will use this as another stick to beat us with. And these would be sisters who would say, the rest of my community are too old and too weak, and they are hurting too much. And I can't do this because it will be distorted or manipulated. So what I'm suggesting is that is a legitimate response, even if it's not a convenient response for those of us who want to use the records. But it is around sensitivities, and it's also around knowledge. And sometimes I say to sisters, the history will be written anyway, but you may not be still here to be part of the process. So if we could somehow capture an answer that's satisfactory and helpful to religious around this, that communicates in some way a message that historians and researchers and archivists are responsible and caring. It comes right back to your question, what are you going to do with this? But it's also around the question, who cares?
I think around who cares and also around trust. I think we've said that. I think that's really, if we could trust people, and that would be I think you're right, sensitivity is something.
yeah, and then I think the broader action becomes, it's about communication. Are you talking and are you listening? Is the archivist talking and listening? Is the leadership talking and listening? Not necessarily in that order. You know, in a very open way, and not just immediately putting up a wall that says no.
I think too, and with my trust thing is, I think it's important that the sisters or the brothers or the priest's story be told from their voices. And if we have historians and archivists who can help us tell that story, then we will be a part of the history, which I think is the goal. We just have to find ways that help people to be comfortable with the story. And sometimes that's hard, but I like the idea.
Jim's been trying, and then the gentleman in the center. Okay. And that will be our last two, because we're doing well, but we're just about time to go here.
I'm Jim Carroll. I'm actually a historian. First of all, I think that the importance of this conference is we've been talking a lot about communities and dioceses and that, but there are also numerous communities, Oblate Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, we talked about a little bit earlier, that have 3 or 4 members, a very interesting history, and what will happen with their records, because I doubt that the archives in places like the Dakotas would have the resources that Philadelphia would have. And as a matter of fact, I've been in a lot of archives. Maryknoll, I've been in archives, I've been in Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and only one time did I ever really get any sense of even minor pushback or sensitivity. All I've really encountered is cooperation. Now, I have to say that that's been fairly universal. My question to all 3 of you is this. As a historian, you have an obligation to your profession to tell the story. In other words, to use the sources. Obviously, don't attack, place it in a context. I've had a lot of recent experience on things like childcare, which has become a very controversial issue. Well, it was that's a societal issue, not just a church issue. It was just happened to be an issue that some church members were involved in and has become very sensitive. But eventually, the story has to be told based on your best read of the sources and the documents and your own sense of context. And sometimes that's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt whether you're talking about civil society, state institutions, or religious institutions. So I think sometimes in telling the story and in communicating our past, you don't want to, but if that's where the sources bring you, sometimes that's where you have to write. That's what you have to kind of report. And I think that's one of the problems with church. Past church was the whole idea of glorifying everything and covering over any sort of wart or blemish. Now I think, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened once or twice in my career where I've had to write something that was based on my reading of the sources, and that, of course, can be challenged as well. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Okay, our last question.
I just wanted to sort of make a pitch for a more global approach coming from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where, of course, we have many of the same challenges you do here in the U.S. I've heard Canada thrown in a few times. Thank you for that. I'm also a Canadian. But, sorry, I can be very loud. I can't get there without making everybody move. But I'll be very, very loud, which is we should push for a more global approach. Many of the archives and materials that tell the story of congregations here in the United States or in Canada are often held overseas. Rome is the most obvious example, but by no means the only one. The University of Notre Dame has just done an excellent project, a guide to archives in Rome related to America. But unless this gets attacked on a basis beyond simply the United States and a walk-on role for Canada, we're going to find, I think, this is the Canadian chip on the shoulder, I think we're going to find we have all the same set of problems. Our materials move across borders. The Catholic Church is nothing if not transnational. It is true of its archives. So I would hope that we can, as we move along in what is necessarily a North American approach, that just remember these issues exist, and that we can try and bring them in. There are people in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Ireland, who are trying to pursue some of the same challenges. Just to throw that out there as a, don't forget about us.
Well, thanks to our panelists, and join me in giving them one more round of applause. Okay, we've had a great kickoff, so everybody get some rest, and we'll be back at it in the morning. Thank you.